Good evening to you all. On this 31st of October, Reformation Day, for those of us who are here, others may be trick-or-treating elsewhere. My name's Emma Wildwood and I'm from the School of Divinity, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Welker, who's Professor at the University of Heidelberg, as he continues this Gifford lecture. Now, his theme is In God's Image, Anthropology, and the last two sessions that we heard on Monday and Tuesday have asked that first question: are human beings in God's image? And then gone on to look at the human spirit and the divine spirit. This evening, we will hear the third of his 6 lectures, entitled Call to Justice. Just a note that this evening, as in previous evenings, the lecture and questions are being recorded, and the video will shortly be available online at the university's Gifford Lectured web pages. And there's also a correction to note that some of the publicity has said Lecture 6 will be held on Thursday, the 6th of November, the 7th of November, not the 6th. The 7th of November, not the 6th. Anyway, without further ado, I have great pleasure in handing over to Professor Welker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wildwood. Emerging from the horrors of the National Socialist regime, reign of terror, and from the widespread devastation initiated by the Germans in the Second World War, Germany turned its attention to establishing a new domestic political organization, and thereby also a path back to international respectability. In the western part of the divided country, the constitutional draft of the Federal Republic chose the self-designation of a social state governed by the rule of law. So Article 28. Sorry. The designation governed by the rule of law involves the self-obligation to create universally binding laws and to tie the actions of all state organs to this constitution and these laws. The designation social state expresses the political self-obligation to secure social justice and security for all citizens, that is, balanced social equality, and to support the disadvantaged and those otherwise in need of protection. The goal of this double designation, social state and state governed by the rule of law, was to address and solve politically an extremely difficult problem. Namely, securing justice in a complex polity while adhering to a vision of justice that essentially means the freedom and equality of all people. Such politically and legally secured equal treatment of all people before the law and before legal authorities, along with the accompanying equal rights of men, women, and social minorities in public life, evolved into a universal ethos of equality and a universal promise of freedom. The foundation for this principle is, in the 20th century, the United Nations Human Rights Convention of 1948, which states, I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood." The polity, however, encounters enormous formative problems. Insofar as concrete human beings living concrete lives have access to extremely unequal life and developmental circumstances, and to extremely unequal possibilities for implementing their freedom. The question beyond becomes how these formative problems can be addressed in a way that adjusts in a balanced fashion equal opportunities for all members of society, rather than continually repeating or even reinforcing concrete experiences of inequality and curtailed freedom regarding access to material and intellectual goods. This principle of a social state governed by the rule of law constitutes an initial but crucial framework within which the multimodal formative potential of the spirit can become to bear in working towards social circumstances that merit being called just. In post-war Germany, this framework was supported by a renewal of moral resources and of religious circumstances and educational initiatives. A great role was played by the American program of re-education, initiated carefully in Germany and in Japan. Extremely thoughtful and working with many, many institutions, not only religious, educational, other institutions, and really bringing us in a multimodal way back on track. The combination of the rule of law and protection of the weak provides two intellectual and institutional visions of development. First, the legal framework must develop as a humane set of laws that excludes neither persons nor groups on the alleged periphery of society. Such a corpus of laws, however, must understand that a commitment to justice involves more than creating laws commensurate with justice, and it is here that the orientation towards protection of the weak discloses creative developmental possibilities for the evolution of law. The legal encoding of the protection of the weak, moreover, prevents a society from simply making do with the admittedly kind and valuable willingness to help exhibited by individuals and groups. That is, the protection of the weak must be institutionally integrated, legally secured, and universally accepted and expected in complex communities well beyond the simple, valuable ethos of concern for one's fellow citizens. In the practice of law, this rigorous orientation toward the protection of the weak addresses a paradox that confronts all legal and moral development. What is at work here? People and social institutions are intent on developing and improving their legal rights and modes of moral communication. But how can they address this difficult but indispensable task without endangering or even losing the normative binding powers of law and morality? Law and morality have to offer security of expectations. If you want development, how can you help not losing security of expectations? After all, law and morality must elicit confidence in all their operations, that is, must insist on reliable, enduring validity. Here, the combination of the rule of law with an ethos of protecting the weak proves beneficial in providing energy and stability in the development of just law. So I come to my first part, justice and the protection of the weak, a millennial-old ethos. A social state governed by the rule of law, by committing to this particular twofold self-obligation in its search for a new political, legal, and moral beginning after 1945, Germany joined a long and grand tradition. For many people in the Christian West, this combination of law and mercy, justice and institutionalized protection of the weak evokes familiar biblical traditions that present God as just and merciful and in turn expect human beings as the image of God, similarly to exercise justice and provide help for the needy and the weak. However, we find this combination of law and protection of the weak not just in Judaism and Christianity, but also in other sacred writings among the world religions and far beyond. Natural theology might well take note that this combination was politically documented over 4,000 years ago, in a fashion that comes across not only as morally and sympathetic and humane, but also as significant for any establishment of political loyalty and efficient legal culture. Well over 4,000 years ago, the Sumerian ruler Urukagina, who reigned around 2350 BC, declared that he had brought peace to the city of Lagash, one of the oldest cities in the Near East, northwest of the conjunction of Euphrates and Tigris rivers, so that he brought peace to the city of Lagash by becoming an advocate for widows and orphans. That is, here the ruler himself interceded on behalf of the weak in general and of widows and orphans in particular. Urukagina fought against the exploitation of the economically weak by the strong and liberated the town's inhabitants from debt bondage. His self-designation as the protector of widows and orphans apparently procured for him the political loyalty, even of those not specifically threatened at the time by poverty or other distress, and created thus a climate of peace for all. The king as an insurance company. The legal text of Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, the oldest known legal corpus, 2100 BC, propagated the protection of the weak even in its prologue. The prologue of the Code of Hammurabi, the emblematic, this is Hammurabi. The emblematic legal code of Mesopotamian civilization, about 18th century BC, states that Hammurabi, the devout and God-fearing prince, was chosen to cause justice to prevail in the land, that the strong might not oppress the weak. This is still Urukagina. I'm very bad in PowerPoints, I'm sorry. This is Hammurabi, of course. The epilogue repeats this theme and explicitly associates it with the protection of the orphans and the widow. The Old and the New Testament then incorporate this thematic protection of widows and orphans from neglect, oppression, and exploitation into their own texts almost as a foundational leitmotif, and universalize it by expanding it to include a large group of personae miserae. Legal texts and prophetic admonitions repeatedly enumerate anew such lists of the weak that need not only practical, individual, and moral help from fellow citizens, but also legal, judicial, political, and religious support. These groups include the poor and the needy, the weak and the humble, those who must do without or otherwise suffer from lack, the oppressed and the stricken, the beaten and the miserable, and also foreigners and slaves. So I quote from many texts in a summarizing way. The repeated emphasis on widows and orphans discloses a multimodal connection with the spirit of family ethos. To thwart the emergence of various forms of injustice and radical inequality with respect to developmental possibilities and life circumstances, the underlying theoretical framework of the social state governed by the rule of law must refer back to plausible considerations of normally family circumstances. To wit, at the beginning of life, all human beings are helpless strangers in the world, and as such profoundly dependent on care and support. Indeed, most will occasionally experience similar helplessness and dependence again, and then as a rule at the end of life as well. In this sense, a universal praxis and commitment to the protection of the weak is clearly associated with family ethos, and it is precisely these experiences that provide a point of contact for a radical ethos of equality. That said, an element of skepticism has emerged today over against the notion that such family ethos is capable of supporting the spirit of justice any longer. Such skepticism derives from the observation that the continued development of family ethos is still severely restricted by powerful patriarchal and gerontocratic traditions and by tenaciously global non-egalitarian practices hostile to freedom. Judith Butler and others suggest that given the inclination often accompanying traditional family ethos to stigmatize persons and lifestyles that deviate from heterosexual, marital, and reproductive traditions, perhaps we best not draw too heavily from family ethos as such when trying to promote the spirit of justice and mercy and its institutionalizations. Nonetheless, encouraging efforts have been made to reconcile the traditional concepts of family with modern modes of freedom without entirely surrendering the formative power of family ethos in law and politics. So I refer to 2019 book from John Whitty, Church, State and Family, Reconciling Traditional Teachings and Modern Liberties. At the same time, drastic changes in the stability traditionally associated with small families and a weakening of the classic connection between religious and family ethos have increasingly prompted many people today to trust other different forms of power. An attractive alternative in this sense is an ethos of liberation and social transformation through legal means, a notion that thinkers in antiquity similarly conceived as a visionary fashion. A few footnote remarks on law and laws. It is immediately obvious that laws must identify and manage instances of acute conflict, that they must counter any escalation of violence and counter-violence, and that they must provide varied forms of conflict limitation and prophylaxis. Conflict limitation alone, however, is still far from an effective rule of law. After all, conflict limitation can also be attained through calculated intimidation. A culture based on the rule of law is attainable only through institutional articulation of conflict types and a careful incorporation of such types into a schema that can be brought to bear to include and comprehend other cases of conflict. So when you want law, you need a typology of conflict cases and a schema that brings this typology in order. The point is not to recall past conflicts merely to evoke interest and concern with respect to individual crises and to treat narratively and imaginatively the way concrete crises are woven and tied into various life circumstances, a wonderful field for literature. Legal thinking, instead, isolates and treats past and recent conflicts as self-enclosed, limited cases that can be articulated as types according to fixed rules. Here we encounter one of the grand accomplishments of jurisprudence. By comprehending concrete conflicts as legal types, one can by and large already anticipate their resolution and ending. They can be treated as soluble problems, that is, in what in principle resemble resolved conflicts. As soon as you have a concrete conflict as a legal case, you can predict the outcome. There are negotiations, of course, and a lot of thinking, and sometimes it's very, very complicated, but as a rule, security of expectation. One genuinely revolutionary insight that opens up new perspectives and potentials for law and the push for justice is that even enduring politically, legally, and economically fixed circumstances of radical social inequality can be treated as acute conflicts. One excellent example is what is known as the slave law in Old Testament, as attested in two biblical legal collections, Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. The first elementary tenet of this law stipulates that when you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt, without payment. The slave law is revolutionary in several respects. First, it elevates the fundamental institution of slaveholding, which in ancient societies was an unquestioned and indispensable part of the economic and social order, into a conflict and a problem subject to regulation. Second, it further defines slaves who, for example, in Rome, were viewed merely as tools with the power of speech. So the Roman scholar and writer Marcus Terentius Varro. So slaves are no longer tools with the power of speech, but they are potentially free human beings to be protected even during their life in slavery. And third, the law itself transcends its functions as an instrument of acute conflict management, insofar as now it now also regulates long-term processes of social transformation. Here, for example, the termination of slavery after 6 years. How long do you have your slave already? Similar to a family ethos that promotes the quest for unconditional human equality and freedom, however, so also is law as a liberating power of social transformation quite ambivalent. For these biblical legal collections merely limit slavery temporally rather than abolish it permanently. And although this limitation does indeed represent human progress, for the slave is at least potentially a free person and is such deserving of protection, also legal protection, it is still worlds removed from the universal ethos of justice in freedom and equality for which we today strive. And although opposition to slavery dragged on for centuries before achieving modest successes, at least no state today would risk legally sanctioning the enslavement of human beings. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares in Article 4 that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Yet, even today, more than 40 million people still live in conditions of slavery and forced labor, and the latent forms are countless. Hence, while one must certainly acknowledge that transformative legal development do contribute, at least modestly, to the emergence of circumstances conducive to freedom and equality, such developments are clearly excessively tedious and tend to drag on unnecessarily or even be obscured. Surprisingly, perhaps, much extolled natural law has contributed to this situation and for centuries has sooner impeded the creation of just social circumstances. And now I come to a part, the work on which shocked me. Grand promises and miseries of natural law. Politically and morally difficult or foundering situations have repeatedly prompted cries for return to natural law. The inevitable waning of initial hopes, however, then similarly issue in laments over the loss of precisely this point of orientation. We lost the orientation of natural law. In his well-known dialogue with Jürgen Habermas, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger found on the one hand that, I quote him, natural law has remained, especially in the Catholic Church, the key issue in dialogue with secular society and with other communities of faith, in order to appeal to the reason we share in common and to seek the basis for consensus about the ethical principles of law in a secular pluralistic society. On the other hand, Ratzinger had to concede that, as he says, this instrument has become blunt. Indeed, that the victory of the theory of evolution has meant the end of this view of nature. It is not, however, the victory of the theory of evolution, but rather the deficient systematic tenability of the association between nature on the one hand and law that takes its orientation from justice on the other, that has deflated and indeed continues to deflate any hope that this instrument might take us further in the question of how one might more enduringly establish justice and righteousness. Natural law obscures a fact most people prefer to ignore, namely that life lives at the cost of other life. I quoted already the mathematician and philosopher in a previous lecture, Alfred North Whitehead. He repeatedly addressed this theme, articulating it quite succinctly in the assertion that natural life is robbery. It lives at the cost of other life. Nature does, it is true, exhibit a high degree of effective organization, fruitfulness, and beauty. It surprises and delights through powers of regeneration and renewal. Every blooming flower, every childbirth, every dawn, every re-emergence of spring is capable of eliciting surprise and delight. But natural earthly life also exhibits the ineluctable cruelty of life at the cost of other life. Even vegetarians must destroy infinitely much life to nourish themselves. Hence, any unqualified references to nature and life as salvific concepts, or certainly any equating of God and nature, are naive and carelessly considered. Those wishing to avoid living under perpetual legal, moral, and religious illusions, those striving for theological sincerity with respect to creation, must ask for an understanding of justice that acknowledges this profound ambivalence attaching to natural life. This systematic foundering of references toward natural law is already evident in the classic collection of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, published in 529. In its initial section, Institutiones, institutions, subdivided private law into the natural law, the law of nations, and the civil law. In 533, the Eastern Roman Emperor, Justinian, legally sanctioned this doctrine in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. In this view, natural law is, I quote from the Institutiones, the law which nature teaches to all animals. For this law does not belong exclusively to the human race, but belongs to all animals, whether of the earth, the air, and the water. Hence comes the union of male and female, which we term matrimony, hence the procreation of bringing up of children. That is, the fundamental formative element here is family ethos. With respect to the alleged breadth of validity of natural law, however, the Corpus Juris Civilis maintains that jurisprudence is not only the science of the just and the unjust, but also the knowledge of things divine and human. Universal competence. The problems raised by associating natural law with justice and righteousness becomes clear the moment we no longer restrict our discussion merely to loving family relationships. The introduction to the Institutiones says, I quote, the maxims of law are these: to live honestly, to hurt no one, to give everyone his due. The command to hurt no one is indeed quite difficult to apply to all animals, whether of the earth, the air, or the water. The moment one accepts what is known the law of the strongest as natural law, the commandment to give everyone his due quite loses the aura of implying that it somehow still involves justice and righteousness. The National Socialists, as is well known, positioned the expression to everyone his due cruelly and cynically over the main gate of the Buchenwald concentration camp, legibly moreover from the inside. Paolo Prodi. Paolo Prodi's History of Justice, a wonderful book, sadly not yet translated into English as far as I know, claims to reconstruct how the concept of justice has been lived and conceived in our Western culture. Although this book's German translation bears the subtitle Vom Recht Gottes zum modernen Rechtsstaat, that is, from God's law to the modern nations of law, references to God's justice, divine law, and God's righteousness are remarkably pale and vague in all the book's sources and interpretive discussions. The guiding perspective focuses on the correlation between the cosmic and natural and the political and legal organization of life circumstances, conditions, and relationships. Divine law in connection with natural law is assigned the role of guaranteeing the normatively binding character of laws and their just disposition. In his book, Prodi traces the perpetually shifting coalitions of divine law, natural law, cosmic and natural regularities, and also of the various political and legal concepts of organization and implementation over the course of Western history. In their own turn, these perpetually shifting configurations have been accompanied by the constant shifting dominance of various ecclesiastical, theological, political, legal, and philosophical institutions and thinkers. Yeah, it was breathtaking how they grabbed for the natural law and then implemented their power. Martin Luther's laconic dictum that we prattle on a great deal about natural law, de lege naturae multa fabulamur, is trenchantly confirmed by the history of the development and reception of this notion of natural law, which has ultimately functioned as a carousel for changing orientational claims and arrogations of power. In modernity's concentration on this theme, it is then the human spirit, human reason, and human conscience that acquire increasing significance. We now hear more and more frequently that natural law in fact resides in the human mind and reason itself. The notions of individual conscience and moral communication now become important players in the multifarious conflicts between obedience to divine law, national law, the prince's commands, and positive law. What ultimately emerges is that, on the one hand, conscience and positive law are emancipated from religion, secularizing of the legal and moral sphere, and on the other, conscience as the inner judge, often in the name of God, is polarized over against professional judges acting in the name of society. My personal rights. But does reference to natural law and to divine and human justice and righteousness not degenerate here into ciphers intended merely to underscore and reinforce the subjective sensibility and feeling for morality and justice, along with the status quo of social power relations? Yeah, so you get a very chilling situation. You free yourself from all these normative powers, and then you have your personal self-righteous moral and legal feelings, and on the other hand, things go on. And the power relations are managed then by the market, the media, and so on. Now, third part, the multimodal spirit of justice. But is it not utterly discouraging to realize that references to natural law can be so unreliable or even deceptive as a foundation for justice? For on what basis, then, are we to establish and defend human equality and freedom? Radically skeptical philosophy suggests dispensing entirely with natural law before comprehensively re-evaluating all our legal, political, and moral preconceptions. As the German philosopher Rüdiger Bittner observes, we have long been accustomed, I quote him, to understanding our behavior, and especially our political behavior, as being subject to a higher authority. For example, to natural law, divine law, the notion of human rights, and so on. However, such authority be conceived, and the realization that in reality these really amount to nothing can be profoundly disturbing, but it need not be. Bittner proposes a modest retreat to personal experience, human prudence, and educational training that rigorously dispenses with not only religious but also political, legal, and moral concepts and general orientational expectations. Following and even intensifying the radical philosophical critique of religion presented by the classical philosophers Feuerbach, Marx, and Nietzsche, he also radically questions the efficacy of this lofty conceptual world with respect to legal and political thinking and action. In a way, he follows Marx's proposal. We have to move on from critique of religion to critique of politics and law. The proclamation of universal human dignity, Bittner maintains, has utterly failed to establish a sheltering aura around the life of each individual human being. But is it generally only through radical ethical skepticism that I present to you with the voice of Bittner in this and in another lecture? Is it only radical ethical skepticism that we can come to terms with this loss of faith in natural law? I'm suggesting in these lectures that we adopt and trust in the power of a multimodal spirit of the thought already evident in numerous historical and empirical contexts. Not a wishful thinking, but already evident. For the synthesizing and differentiating power of the spirit is already at work in myriad processes of cognitive, moral, and aesthetic perceptions and communication. This power cannot, however, be reduced merely to some human mental faculty, regardless of how mighty one may conceive such to be. It is neither nature nor culture, but rather a plethora of natural and cultural circumstances and events that shape and sustain human intellectual operations, and that in their own turn are thereby also shaped and developed further. As operations of the spirit, these human processes are also inherently inclined toward completion and perfection, though in individual cases such an inclination can be quite modest or even dull. And yet more modest steadying tendencies of intellectual life should not seduce one into understanding the powerful creativity of the spirit. Here we must note those particular multimodal spirit interrelations within legal culture, political culture, family ethos, and the ethos of social innovation that have been developed and indeed thoroughly tested for millennia, and which constantly interact with human cognitive, moral, and aesthetic faculties. Hence it is bold, but by no means absurd, to proclaim and work toward an universal ethos and praxis of human dignity, human rights, and justice in the sense of freedom and equality of all human beings. Of course, neither lofty but naively expensive claims, nature demands, culture intends, nor hectic searches for saving principles suffice here. It is instead imperative for us to discover and foster processes of mutual ethical support in both natural and cultural spheres, as long as they are open to being shaped anew by the human spirit. The rule of law, politics, and the intellectual connections between the two are indispensable in the quest for justice. However, the development of their full potential requires that other forces come into play as well. Such include impulses from the spheres of family ethos and social civil ethos, that seek to limit forces hostile to freedom, and support those that favor liberation, as these forces on their own turn ideally derive from a spectrum, since these forces in their own turn ideally derive from a spectrum of empathy that fosters a committed culture of compassionate helping in an unwavering focus on the freedom and equality of all. This expansive spectrum of empathy, however, offers the most varied possibilities for engagement. Ranging from a simple expression of sympathy, "I'm so sorry that you are not doing well," to personal engagement in organized aid, all the way to the lifelong commitment of the entirety of one's energies in helping the weak and disadvantaged. In her 1992 Edinburgh Gifford lectures, Upheavals of Thought, A Theory of Emotions, Martha Nussbaum collected and assessed a wealth of personal emotions of dismayed distress and interpersonal sympathy, gleaned from both literature and philosophical reflection and deriving from both private and public life, including compassion, empathy, altruism, benevolence, sympathy, mercy, pity, partiality, concern, grief. This collection provides a mighty emotional reservoir of terms and moods for articulating both individual and shared feelings and emotions, as well as moral and social processes of communication. This emotional moral reservoir represents an indispensable source and foundation for legal, political, medical, scholarly, and educational strategies for developing and enhancing an ethos of justice, equality, and freedom. This moral resource is especially discernible in those grand figures committed to the protection of the weak and the nonviolent struggle for justice and egalitarian freedom, figures whose exemplary lives have become an indelible part of international cultural memory. Even during their lifetime, Albert Schweitzer, Martin Luther King, and Mother Teresa were honored by the bestowal of the Nobel Prize. In what way, however, does religion strengthen these ethical emotional resources and sustain those models in their pursuit of justice? By focusing on God's vision of human beings, and thus of me as well, religion expands its vision to include the entire breadth of human existence, together with the commonalities and similarities of all human beings and the accompanying potential power. From the perspective of each individual, concrete situation, human beings are unique and unalike. But this perspective changes once we engage in a kind of slow motion view, that is, when we take note of the children, the sick, the weak, the elderly, not only among us, but within us. Without denying our concrete bodily existence, we are able to imagine our own existence in countless other situations with innumerable points of contact and intersections with the ongoing lives of others. Religiously shaped perception and thinking universalizes a person's otherwise quite individual reality. Indeed, some religious traditions associate this expansion of perception with the ascription of enormous human formative powers. That is, God considers human beings capable of a great deal and thus also expects a great deal from them. For God views them within a long-term perspective, far transcending the lives of individuals within any given epoch. Even legal and political ordinances are viewed against the backdrop of expansive temporal horizons in which God rewards good deeds while also, however, punishing children for the inquiry of parents to the third and fourth generation. Legal, political, and moral accomplishments and transgressions are viewed from a perspective far transcending current moral and legal human sensibilities and experiences. The Bible takes careful account of precisely this breadth of human existence and human responsibility in its doctrine of human beings made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and accordingly also with respect to what is known as the Commission for Dominion, the most important documentation for which is Genesis 1, 26 to 28. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish and the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Many interpreters, including prominent voices such as Karl Barths and Jürgen Moltmanns, have abstracted from any notion of forceful dominion over the earth and the world of animals, by understanding this reference to the image of God as applying to the partnership of man and woman, the relationship of I and thou, or to a peaceful plural sociality. Inspired by an influential article by Phyllis Bird, who argued for the important role of the biological couple and of human reproduction in Genesis 1, I argued as early as in my 1991 Princeton Warfield lectures for what Mark Harris has accurately called a functional account of the image in Genesis. Other interpreters adduce the Commission for Dominion as biblical support for ecological brutalism. The text does indeed ascribe a privileged position to human beings over against fellow creatures. It even uses verbs associated with subjugation, rada, kabash, and with the language used to describe conquerors and slaveholders. It thus gives a sober and realistic account of the human species in its relation to fellow creatures that compete for self-sustenance. It does not offer cozy and romantic pictures of an unrealistic harmony of all creatures on earth. Even good gardeners, an image many people would like to apply to humans, even good gardeners never enter their gardens without pruning instruments. But the text speaks clearly against a destructive ecological brutalism, since even conquerors and slaveholders had to take care of the persons that they subjugated. The mandate of dominion privileges the position of the human species, but simultaneously obligates humans, male and female, to exercise such dominion in a fashion informed by sustaining solicitude and care. Our own ecologically imperiled age is not the first to lament human failure in the face of this commission, for even witnesses from antiquity document such dismay. And for just that reason, any reference to human beings as the image of God needs constant self-assessment and self-criticism, as we try to do in this lecture. At the same time, we must remain mindful that human beings, through the divine and the human spirit, have indeed been endowed with the powers necessary for living up to this grand destiny. I was convinced by Davis Ferguson's argument. I quote him, that the concept of the Imago Dei is best interpreted as designating a complex identity that is established by a providential ordering of human life, a divine providential ordering of human life. Ferguson proposes a recourse to a more holistic description that includes functional, relational, and practical elements. He also suggests moving beyond the much admired framework of a theology of revelation that we find in David Kelsey's magisterial Anthropology. My endeavor to supplement Kelsey's Christological and eschatological framing of the Imago teaching by a natural theological concentration on the divine spirit and the human spirit tries to follow this helpful advice. The multimodal spirit sensitizes people to experiences of justice and mercy in personal, familial, social, and political situations, either through personal experience or through personal engagement in bringing about such experiences. That multimodal spirit focuses especially on interpersonal relationships and is rigorously honest in its view of the privileged status of human beings in the creaturely world. And despite numerous discouraging setbacks, it holds fast within a polyphony of feelings, experiences, and engagements on behalf of fellow human beings in the weak to an ethos of justice and equality accompanied by an ethos of freedom, a commitment to truth, and a will to peace. Sanguine patience, a profound sensibility for dignity, though also serene confidence and joy invariably accompany and sustain this activity of the Spirit among, through, and beyond living human beings. Let me offer a very short summary. How can one dispel radical doubts concerning the statement of equality from the United Nations Human Rights Convention of 1948, namely that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, not only by social and political realities, but also philosophically and ethically? How can an ethos of equality be affirmed if natural law is unable to undergird it? The lecture suggests a solution from the perspective of a multimodal spirit that cannot, however, be reduced to mere intellect. For this multimodal spirit has for millennia, in the spheres of jurisprudence, politics, and morality, efficaciously combined the commitment to justice with the commitment to the protection of the weak. This spirit is nourished by various impulses from family ethos, by a broad spectrum of feelings of empathy, and by religious perspectives that direct our attention across multiple generations and toward the grand destiny of human beings, something naturally also discernible in secular contexts. In this capacity, the multimodal spirit provides impetus to the worldwide peaceful struggle for justice and the resulting edification and elevation of human beings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your challenging lecture. I was reminded when you talked about Leviticus 21 and the unacceptably poor standard of releasing slaves after 6 years. But I was also reminded of the Jubilee legislation of Leviticus, which is a much more radical piece of legislation, a code of law that has something to do, I think, with the redistribution of wealth, which returns lands to its owners after 49 years, and other property to those owners, which sets everyone free, and, if you like, resets the wealth clock to zero, well, at least to zero for the wealthy. There's a strong bias to the poor, and a justice motif there. I would be interested in your comments.
Well, there are various elements in the biblical traditions that illuminate the high importance of care for the weak. From these grand institutions that you named, the Jubilee year in large time spans, to the command not to take the mantle, the coat of the poor overnight when he has debts. Yeah? So we have all sorts of forms. And I just stuck to the slave law in order to give you I think, nice example how the law can be brought into a position to move beyond its usual functions of regulation of acute conflicts and protecting against acute conflicts, but the law functions as a social transformation. And I think this gives you a wonderful example of the multimodal activities of the law and the spirit of the law. But I agree, there are numerous other forms. Some of my Old Testament scholar friends said, well, we are not sure whether they ever executed this Jubilee year. But at least it's a wonderful vision. And also when you are realistic, even Uru Kagina, a Swiss Old Testament colleague said to me, well, maybe he introduced the care for the widows and orphans because he sent men to war. Yeah? So there's always in political, religious, moral and other conditions, a second and first layer and second and third thought on the wonderful political, moral and religious and legal achievements. Yet, I want to argue that we have a whole bundle of forms in the multimodal spirit striving for justice and equality that reinforce each other. Yeah? So what I would like to bring over in these lectures is that you really address spirit. You get neither only the bipolar intellectual spirit nor the numinous spirit, but a very, very convincingly orchestrated field of energies that brought together can really work for the betterment of the world, a better honoring of God, and also the ennoblement of human beings toward the image of God.
Hello, Dr. Welker. Thank you for your lectures. They've been really good and really insightful. I do have a question about what the multimodal spirit is directed towards, and just in terms of kind of frame that question. So the intellectuals tradition would probably want to say the intention is to represent the world as it is in an objective sense. And kind of going from your previous lecture using kind of an interactionist model with children and early childhood development, that makes me think of Sean Gallagher, a philosopher who reframes that kind of intentionality, not as objecting the world as is, but as making use of the world. And so kind of coming from Merleau-Ponty with motor intentionality of how can I grip the world? And so that seems to be the intention of what a multimodal thing would be, at least in Gallagher's eyes, is to get a grip on the world. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit what you kind of conceive of the multimodal spirit you're talking about as being directed towards, because as Gallagher puts it, at a basic level, that also seems to have a very kind of, as what Whitehead said, like nature is robbery, or pragmatics doesn't always have to be, or isn't always just or free. And so how do you kind of think about that in terms of this, like in that question? Yeah.
I'm very grateful for your question because I made a strong point that the spirit is not just an intellectual spirit. And I wrestled in my second lecture with the Aristotelian and the transcendental framework that the spirit is just moving intellectually up. It's of highest importance. And in my lecture on truth, I will give more justice to this. And my point is, this alone doesn't give us the full picture of the spirit. There is I love to quote Whitehead, you have noticed this already. Whitehead said, common sense says, shouldn't we take the world as it is? And Whitehead says, the sad thing is, there is no world as it is. We always have it in the framework of thought and perception. Yeah. And the dogmatism of the common sense is, I see the world as it is. Of course, isn't it? Subject, object, I and thou. Yeah. And so a more refined view that we need in order to address these desperate topics requires more ambitious understandings of the spirit. And I try to insist with the spirit we need really the spirit striving for justice, striving for freedom, striving for truth, striving for peace. In the end, love and joy are also important elements. It's not endless, but there are a multiplicity of conjunctions. And David Tracy asked yesterday, couldn't we make more sense of the aesthetics? Trying to test Hegel, and I thought a lot about that. It would be wonderful to bring in the aesthetic powers and see how have they an impact on legal and religious modes of thought. First in Hegel's mind, because if you open all the gates, you won't see anything. But I agree, it is crucial to have this intellectual dimension of the spirit. But it's also very, very important to move beyond that. And I tried with early childhood development to show how loaded the spirit is already with the first deixis. And we always said, oh, primitive. Yeah, now let's go on to education. Now let's go on to see the world in an intellectually shaped way. Highly important, of course. I'm passionate for academia and education and so on and so on. And I don't want to throw out the intellectual side of the spirit, but we definitely have to supplement it. And I learned it only in recent years by many of my colleagues who said emotion. I said, oh, emotion, feuilleton. And then the body. I said, oh yeah, okay, of course, the body, but it's more for medical and so on. And finally, they came on us, transcendentalists and metaphysicians and so on, and convinced us that we had utterly reductionistic concepts of epistemology and anthropology, and that we have to do better. And of course, here comes the biblical traditions already. They have already this full-fledged and other religious traditions in their sacred texts. They have already a much more elaborated understanding of the human being. So many forces come together and then finally take you out of your intellectualist slumber.
Thank you very much, Professor Welker, for a fascinating lecture. Just really a simple question, but maybe quite a fundamental one. You spoke a good deal about natural law. I'm very conscious that when people speak about natural law, they often work with different conceptions of natural law. Some of them more modest, some of them more ambitious, some of them more inclined to be amenable to supplementation or transformation from the supernatural, and some maybe eschewing that kind of move. So, and the critiques can apply to some of the conceptions far better than others. So it was just to ask for, just to ask a bit more about to get some more information about your conception of natural law, or at least the conception of natural law that you're working with for the purposes of these lectures. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I try to have in mind, and also with the help of Prodi, this multitude of conceptions of natural law that you line up. And I was fascinated how many power connections were blessed, so to speak, or sealed by the notion of natural law in history. My point was that when you look at the basic document, the Institutiones, and see what they have claimed, then you come up, if you're honest, that natural law, if you take nature seriously, is the law of the stronger. It is. And in a way, in the call to dominion, there is this element involved when we just take the functional view. Yeah, therefore, I was so grateful to Professor Ferguson that he said, please, yeah, he wrote a wonderful book on the polyphony of divine Vorsehung, providence, divine providence, also the polyphony. Yeah? And I think we are currently moving out of these monolithic bipolar modes of addressing these issues. And you can say, well, natural law is much richer, but it's very hard to skip nature in it. And we did consultations on the concept of law in science, legal studies, and theology, published this, multi-year projects, and we investigated it very, very carefully. And as I mentioned, it came as a shock to me, because for me, natural law was also a kind of cushion I did not really, was too fond of, but I thought, yeah, we have to do it. We have this, and it's indispensable. But I think it is a poisonous thing. And also in our time, I addressed this before, this enormous enthusiasm for nature and life as salvific terms is dangerous, because it doesn't touch reality. Yeah? What our colleague said. It touches parts of it. The beauty, the fecundity of nature, wonderful, 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 but this is not the whole story. And then you get this muddling, then they say, it's family, and the loving family, and then people say, well, loving family is already declining, and so I would not buy into that so much, but I think family life is only a small part of natural life. And when they go after cosmic regularities, then you can say, well, okay, cosmic regularities, there you have more steadiness of expectations, and here you can make use of the security of expectation maybe, but even in cosmic terms, we learned from the cosmologist that stellar systems had to evolve, that had to turn into dust to produce the stardust out of which we are all made. So even with cosmic orders, we see also quite some discontinuity and so on. So, but these are deep, deep issues. But on the whole, we have to be very careful with taking nature and life as unqualified salvific terms. This is my cantus firmus, and this also has an impact on the natural law traditions. And my argument against Ratzinger was, it is not just evolution. It is already in the basic conceptual framing that the fathers had nice intentions, but it was too much systematic cheating in it. And here a systematic theologian has to bring in the magnifying glass and say, well, sorry, you want to say that we have a harmonious life all over and that we should not do harm to anybody, and this is valid for the fish and the birds and the animals, and you have to say, sorry, it's not the case.
With natural law, there's a suggestion that it is the survival of the strongest. But you were suggesting, if I understand it correctly, that there's a multimodal spirit that's somehow striving for freedom and equality. Yeah. Does that suggest in your mind that this multimodal spirit is progressive, that things are getting better? Because if so, the multimodal spirit doesn't seem to be doing terribly well in the world. Just from your first lecture, when we looked at the huge number of not only animal creatures or sentient beings, but human beings who come into this world and live very short and very miserable lives.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is no automatism in the working of the Spirit. There is an enormous amount of frailty, and we need a very sober notion of creation. And I learned this from Genesis 1. Most people say, oh, God determines everything, and he saw it was good. Thank you. Well, the world is full of conflict. Already the call to dominion regulates power structures between the humans and the animals. And the world is finite and frail and has the potential of sin and self-endangerment, and. I think a sober view on creation should not eradicate our gratitude for the beauty, the abundance, the regularities, and so on, but we should also see creation is good, but it's not paradise. In Hebrew it says it's life-furthering, but obviously life-furthering also means eating and being eaten. I learned it from my biological brother. He said, many species have to be eradicated to 90% as food for others in order to make life livable on the planet. Otherwise, they would take over and would extinguish the other forms of life. But of course, 10% has to survive in order to give the richness of that. And I think here I would wish that we have less simple worldviews, that we engage more clearly the scriptural witnesses and the scientific findings about the reality of life. And the reality of life is pretty sobering and sometimes depressing, and this is why I dared to offer you this first lecture. Yeah? And I think coming out of Germany and having lived in Berlin after the war with all these walls of silence and all these ruins and all these disabled people and our parents unable to talk about all these things they had gone through. This is very deep in my bones. And I wouldn't have dared to bring it to you, all this German story, if I would not suffer very much from more and more societies on the planet falling back from free societies into distorted political, legal, religious, and moral forms. And so I think, I was glad to have Hannah Arendt as a sparring partner, and her fantastic warnings. I read all her stuff again for this lecture. These high sensitivities for the self-endangerment of human species. But of course, I do not want to talk you into distress and misery. I think the counterforces are also enormous. Yeah? And I absolutely believe in the good providence and the divine grace and the richness of the powers of the Spirit that want to get us out of this distress and realistically endow us with counterforces against lie and injustice and all sorts of destruction.
May I think that what we're seeing with multimodality is today's global society is a massive Tower of Babel. I am very aware that law involves linguistic skill, intellect, a very particular, and it requires an understood expression. May I refer back to the Right Reverend Rowan Williams's collection of previous Gifford lectures on the represented idea. The idea that I give to you or write down on paper, is that going to be visualized as the same idea within my audience's head, the received representation of an idea? And this Tower of Babel, whenever we try to put something down into law, it could be interpreted in a myriad of different ways. And it's almost as if multimodal society, the spirit, is somehow getting itself in a tangle here, because the limitation of our language abilities is hindering our development of human spirit towards a godly existence.
Well, we worked very carefully with law scholars on a topic that to many people seemed boring at a first glance, and this was legal and theological dogmatics. And the jurists also speak of dogmatics. And then we looked at our structure, and it was fascinating. we look for key concepts, God, justice, first level. Already on this first level, you can, if you have some experience, see whether something good comes out of that or not. But this is only one level. The second level, codified, canonized texts. Suddenly not one thought, wow. Yeah. The whole biblical canon, the whole legal texts and so on. Immense, immense. But normative texts. The third, selection of these texts, constitutions, confessions, and so on. Yeah, so you get a selection of topics burned down. But these are only the 3 first levels, and for a long time, we systematic theologians were very happy with these 3 levels. At best, some were happy with level 1, or the biblical scholars just with level 2. Then comes the academy, yeah, and also a differentiated structuring of religion and theology and the roles of the academy. I don't go into the details, but then you see already we have some faith traditions that don't bother much with the academy and university training. But we thought it's very important. Then come the practical areas. Yeah, also different structures. And in the end come the individuals who call upon God and upon the courts. And here also different basic moods and so. So we had between 9 and 12 levels of normativity that you have to bring together to have a decent theological and legal dogmatics. And we learn from each other and see, here you're doing better, here we are doing better. And these are the kinds of investigations we are currently pushing forward. And some people say, oh, it's confusing, and so all these many levels. No, it's freeing. Because when you get stuck on one level, then you see possibilities on the other. Yeah, so and it's not evasion, no vagueness, no relativism. So, but to see the richness of our academic, theological, religious, cultural possibilities, and then you can join forces and say, okay, we zoom in on these and these and these topics and problems, and from there on, we try to provide helpful proposals.
Well, thank you very much for answering our questions so thoroughly. And thank you to you all for being here and participating. We very much look forward to Lecture 4, Monday, 5:30, here again, Call to Freedom. And perhaps we can extend our thanks once again to Professor Welker.